Kaptur from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
5 minutes to include extraneous material in the record thereof.
Without objection, Ms. Kaptur is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, today the White House apparently made an announcement that they're considering a proposal to head off potentially millions of more home foreclosures by using federal funds to buy up at-risk loans and apparently refinance them. It's one of several proposals that the White House is looking at. I would urge the new President of the United States not to allow the federal government to purchase toxic assets. And I'm placing in the record an article from late last fall by William Isaac, the former head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation during the 1980s, the early part of the 80s, late 70s, when over 3,000 banks in our country were resolved without going to the taxpayers to bail out the problem loans. And essentially, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation used something called the Net Worth Certificate Program, whereby they were able to resolve over $100 billion worth of insolvency in the savings banks for a total expenditure to them of less than $2 billion. The program involved no sub outlay. The FDIC purchased net worth certificates in troubled banks, and the agency determined then whether they could be viable if over time, and banks entered the program had to agree to strict supervision from the FDIC. If such a program were enacted today, the capital position of banks with real estate holdings would be bolstered, giving those banks the ability to sell and restructure assets and get on with their rehabilitation. No taxpayer money would be spent, and the asset sale transactions would remain in the private sector where they belong. The banks do not need taxpayer money to carry their loans. They need for the FDIC, time-tested in what it has done in the past, to use proper accounting and regulatory policies that will give them time to work through all of these problem loans. When the FDIC handled the Washington Mutual situation in an orderly manner, there was no cost to the FDIC nor the taxpayers. What I'm fearful of is that the very same securities dealers on Wall Street that have benefited handsomely from the TARP and from all of the housing bubble of the 1990s are now going to find another way to put these same loans together and make more money off of us, the American people. And you know, they're so powerful, they even sit on the New York Federal Reserve board up there in New York City, primary dealers whose names you will recognize: Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, HSBC. The worst wrongdoers in the crisis are sitting right up there in New York City with their hands on the money spigots. They send their associates down here to head up the Treasury Department. And what was interesting is that Countrywide used to be on the Fed. They took them off a couple years ago. I guess I complained too much, so I don't see Countrywide. I guess they collapsed. They're not on the list anymore. You look down this list, Dresdner Kleinworth Securities over in Germany, that bank is on its knees. It's being bought by Commerzbank and then Commerzbank by the Allianz Insurance Group in Germany. They're on the list of our primary dealers in New York City at the Federal Reserve there. This is a closed circle, my friends. Over the next few days, I'll be talking about what happened during the 1990s, where these very same Wall Street and money center banks, the very same ones on this list, planned to over-leverage the U.S. economy and housing market through such schemes as mortgage-backed securities, through which they benefited handsomely in home equity loans, and they made extraordinary profits. Their executives, their shareholders, their board members, and the net result of their combined actions has been to indebt our country on the private side and ultimately now try to shift all of that debt to us, to our children, and to our grandchildren. And they sit on the board of the Federal Reserve Board up in New York. The 10 or 15 primary dealers, the very same ones that did all of this damage, these same institutions lobbied all during the 1990s and in this decade to change federal laws that aided and abetted their plan. In 1994, the Regal-Neal Interstate Banking and Branching Act that hastened all these mergers that made them bigger and then in 93 and 94 changing the rules over at the Department of Housing and Urban Development to allow home builders like Countrywide to approve their own loans. They changed the underwriting and appraisal standards, and then again allowing lenders to select their own appraisers back in the early 1990s, and then in 1995 changed the Securities Litigation Act here, and finally the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act overturned in 99. Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, I have to tell you, the American people will begin to see how the pieces of this puzzle fit together, and they all lead back to the Wall Street mega center banks. I yield back my remaining time.